千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As always, I want to extend my welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we are ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. And now, without further ado, let us return together to Tao Te Ching 7. As we discussed previously, the title for this chapter is The Selfless. It is called The Selfless because the Tao is described as flowing, continuous, inexhaustible, something we should fully use. And the visual imagery for this is the river flowing through the heart of the valley. This river nourishes and sustains all living things in the valley, and that includes humans. It does this with impartiality. It serves all equally without selfish concerns. Every living thing partakes in the benefits of the river without trying to monopolize it. So these ideas translate directly to our own utilization of the Tao. The Tao serves all of us without favoritism, and we in turn partake in the Tao without trying to make it proprietary to us. In short, we share the Tao. Sharing is caring. It is therefore all about being selfless. So let's take a look at the chapter itself. Here is chapter 7. And as you can see, it's a relatively short chapter. Only 9 lines. And we're able to analyze it and divide it into 2 sections. And here's the result of the sectional analysis from last time. Section 2 has the most obvious repeating characters in lines 6 and 7. Section 1 has key characters in different locations within the lines. And as you may recall, the first section is about the everlasting heaven and earth. We talked about the reason for heaven and earth being everlasting, and it is because they exist for myriad things, not for themselves. This idea applies very well at the personal level. So I would like to provide a quick recap of our discussion from last time. We began with this slide, which was about the eternal nature of heaven and earth. And we know when we talk about heaven and earth, it's an expression that refers to the world, or it's a reference to everything that the ancients could perceive. We then compared the ancient concept of everything with the modern understanding from science about this incredible universe in which we live. Of course, today we know the universe existed long before the origin of human beings. We ourselves came much, much later than the beginning of the universe. And there's a vast universal timescale that is almost beyond human comprehension. Because of that, last time we used the cosmic calendar from science education to help us understand. In the cosmic calendar, everything from the very beginning of the universe up until this moment in time is compressed into a 1-year time frame, where every month represents more than 1 billion years. In the first half of the year, the first 6 months that you see in this slide, this time span represents about 7 billion years. And when we look at it this way, our own galaxy, the Milky Way, this is the galaxy in which we live, it did not come into being until the month of May in this time scale. And this is all the more astonishing when you realize that our galaxy is one of many. Scientists estimate that the entire observable universe contains between 200 billion to 2 trillion galaxies altogether. So we have Tao Te Ching 42 that talks about the beginning, the very beginning of existence itself, with 4 lines capturing the Tao producing the one producing the 2. These are abstract concepts that apply to different areas of physics. 2 produce 3, 3 produce myriad things, and as we discussed before, in this context, the myriad things are the stars themselves. Then we looked at the second half of the cosmic calendar, the months from July to December. We note that the first half of the year was completely devoid of human beings. And when we look at the second half of the year, we see that our own solar system did not exist until the month of September. Of course, when we talk about the solar system, we're also talking about the sun, the moon, the other planets in the solar system, like Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and so on. Therefore, this cosmic calendar is an easy way for us to see that heaven and earth were not created at the same times, as the ancients might have assumed, without the information provided by modern science. Also, in the second half of the calendar, specifically in the last month, December, that is where you have the myriad things coming into the picture. That's flora and fauna, plants and animals, multicellular life. All of this did not exist until December, the last month. And we zoom in previously on the last month, and we focused on the last few days, and then on the last few seconds. The image in this slide shows the last minute, but our focus was on the last 6 seconds because in the cosmic calendar, The Tao Te Ching was written 6 seconds ago. The origin of the Tao goes back further than 6 seconds. In terms of written records, the origin of the Tao can be traced back to roughly 11 seconds ago, which is about 5,000 years ago. The origin of the Tao, in terms of oral tradition, before the invention of writing, likely goes back much further, possibly 30 seconds ago in the cosmic calendar. Of course, when we bring our thoughts back to the present, we quickly realize that our modern world, everything we know, the recent history that you and I are familiar with, all of this took place within a tiny fraction of the last second. Thinking about this is like the contemplation of eternity by ancient sages. This gives us a proper sense of perspective, and it is so grand, so vast, that it humbles us with the sheer magnitude of existence. So beyond the cosmic calendar, this is the last slide that we got to in the previous meeting. In that slide, this one that we're looking at here, we talked about the difference between service-oriented leadership and power-oriented leadership. The service orientation is about supporting others, helping them to be at their very best. The power orientation is about acquiring strength and authority for oneself. It is the difference between selfless and selfish. So as we begin to talk about this idea, this ancient Tao, about leadership, about group dynamics, and mapping it to the present with servant leadership, I want to present comparison and contrast to help us come to grips with the idea. So our talk today begins with 2 columns, the one on the left showing the sage, the one on the right showing the tyrant. So in the Tao Te Ching, these are the 2 diametrically opposite archetypes. The sage is someone who leads or serves with the Tao. The tyrant, of course, is someone who oppresses with authority, with the abuse of power. So when we talk about them in modern day vernacular, the sage is what we today would call the servant leader, someone who leads, but someone who has the servant humble mentality. The tyrant in today's verbiage would be the autocratic leader, someone who tries to dominate with a domineering personality. And let's talk about the difference between the 2. For the sage and servant leader, one characteristic that's been observed in thousands of years is listening. The sage is interested in hearing what people have to say. The tyrant, not so much. The tyrant loves the sound of his own voice. When the tyrant is asking others for their opinions, what the tyrant really wants is affirmation of what he already thought, validation, and perhaps flattery. So remember, these are archetypes. These represent common patterns seen every day, everywhere in life. So as an example, you can apply this to all different walks of life. The horrible boss, the quote-unquote the boss from hell, that would be simply a manifestation of the tyrant, the right-hand column. Another characteristic of the sage is that of empathy. The sage is empathetic. The sage cares about how people feel. Now, when I list out these two characteristics as others that are following, it is the same in that it'll make it clear there's a pathway for you and I to sagehood, that we can become more like the sage if we listen with empathy. So the sage is the one not only listens, but cares about how people feel. Whereas you can imagine the tyrant does not care. The tyrant is egocentric. The tyrant cares, but only about his own feelings, his own likes and dislikes. There's no consideration for others. And I was just talking about the horrible boss. If you think about it, the horrible boss has these characteristics without a doubt. Another characteristic is persuasion. That is, the sage explains why. The sage explains the best path with sound reasoning. The sage is enlisting people to the cause, and these people, having been convinced by reason, are willing participants. This is very different from the approach of the tyrant. The enlisting of the tyrant is not so much a request, but a command. The tyrant expects unquestioning obedience. And next, we have the characteristic of community. The sage builds communities. The sage builds and strengthens relationships among people. Whereas it isn't so much about the community for the tyrant, but the hierarchy, the levels above and below. The tyrant enforces this power structure that oppresses everyone at the bottom. Now, it is worth noting that when you create strong personal bonds, the sage is somebody that people remember, and people will come back and seek out the sage when they can, whenever possible. Same with the servant leader. Whereas the damage on personal relationships means that for the tyrant, people try to get away from the tyrant as soon as possible. The next characteristic, inspiring, being inspirational. This is to say, the sage provides a vision that motivates people. It's not just about why should we do this? It is envisioning. Just imagine what will happen if we do this, if we head down this path. The benefits to us, the safety and security, the reasons why we should do it in a compelling vision. That vision motivates. So instead of being inspirational, the tyrant is intimidating. It is not so much inspiring people, enlisting them to a vision for the future, but forcing them. It's coercion. And the purpose is for the glory of the tyrant. In the example of the horrible boss, basically the horrible boss wants to look good and doesn't care how he gets the people, forces the people to work on his behalf so he can look good. And then we have foresight. The sage looks ahead, makes long-term plans. The sage is a planner. It is not true that in the Tao, people are supposed to just wander around without a specific goal in mind. The sage is always looking at the journey of 1,000 miles with a destination, with a direction. That journey of 1,000 miles is a long-term plan. On the other hand, the tyrant is short-sighted. The tyrant is all about immediate gratification. Now, when we look at these comparisons, I want everyone to mentally envision how this applies in ancient China so long ago, but also apply them today. And the challenge in applying this to our world today is to let go of the preconceptions of Western culture, but instead think universally. For instance, when we talk about the family, the team, I want everyone to think in terms of group dynamics in general. After all, the Tao is not about East or West, but the entire world, humanity overall. So when we talk about leader in this context, it doesn't have to be the CEO, the horrible boss that I mentioned, the manager of a department. I want to invite you to think instead about the person who, out of wisdom and compassion, provides support and guidance in the background. Now, in ancient China, this person may not be the king or the general, but the strategist who provides advice and plans deployment, missions, ambush, negotiations, and so on. Indeed, there's a wealth of stories about this kind of person from the Three Kingdoms period. Its most famous strategist, Kongming, was not the ruler. He served the ruler. But there was no question that he was a leader of the Tao, what we would call a servant leader today. In modern times, we also have many such examples. Think about a family. The mother who raises her kids may not be the head of the household. And perhaps in her family, her husband is the primary breadwinner and therefore usually considered the head of the family, but that doesn't matter because there can be no doubt of her central role. She is in front, as Lao Tzu puts it. She is a servant leader. She is the heart and soul of her family. For another example, think about sports. A professional sports team in modern times, at the very least, has a team owner, a team manager. Among the athletes themselves in that team, there is a team captain. The person that Lao Tzu describes can be one of these individuals, team owner, team manager, team captain, but not necessarily. And that is the crucial point. It may be, for example, the coach who places himself last, supporting all the players, but then ends up in front because he is the true servant leader of the team. So to further illustrate this concept, I'd like to take everyone to a diagram that depicts everything visually, especially the before and after, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. In this diagram, I have the before and after depicted as what I call the initial state and the end state. Here is the initial state. So the person in the back of the group is the sage. As you saw in the previous slide, the group is generic in nature. Doesn't have to be co-workers in the office. It can also be family, circle of friends, community, your church, sports team, a club. It's basically any setting where people gather together for a common purpose. In that setting, the sage supports the group in the back, behind the scenes. The sage, quote unquote, there's quotation marks around the sage. The sage is not some wise old man, but the sage is a generic representation of a wise person of any possible age or gender. The only requirement is that this person must be genuine in his or her desire to be of service. This would be a wish to see the group do well, not a plot or a scheme to advance oneself. So what happens when people see this? They see this capable individual who's serving the entire group, and they realize it is genuine. And they can see that it's genuine because the sage is consistent over time. You get to know someone after a length of time. They can therefore see it is in their best interest to pay more attention to the sage. This begins the process in group dynamics to elevate the profile of the sage to the end state. This is to say, the people in the group, they will move the sage toward the front and center of the group, and this provides greater leverage for the sage to be even more of a service to the group as a whole. This is a more prominent role. It may not be a formal leading position. It may just be attention and respect accorded to someone that everybody in the group trusts. Somebody that everybody knows has valuable things to contribute to the entire group. And therefore, as I mentioned, by this idea means it may not be leading the charge at all. When Lao Tzu says that people put the sage in front, it may or may not be leading the charge. It can just be providing inspiration or motivation. So I want to ask everyone to keep your thoughts flexible as you apply this life pattern to the many different situations we can come across in life. As you observe these different situations, keep in mind the passage from this chapter. Therefore, the sages place themselves last, but end up in front. And that is how this works. Let's continue on. Line 7. Line 7 says, are outside of themselves and yet survive. It basically says that the sages are outside of themselves and yet survive. These expressions are specific to the time of their writing by Lao Tzu. Let's break down the first 3 characters. The first character means outside. Second character is the possessive, there. And then the third character typically means body, but can mean self, in this case, selves. Outside themselves is the translation. To be outside of yourself here means being concerned about others. This expression from ancient times is no longer used in modern Mandarin. The sages are focused on the well-being of others and not themselves. It is fortunately very easy to understand this expression just by using logic and reasoning. When your thoughts are within yourself, internal to yourself, the meaning is that you are concerned about your own needs, your benefits, your opportunities. You worry about the threats to your own safety or well-being, the things that can have a negative impact on you. Therefore, when your thoughts are outside of yourself, the meaning is the opposite. You are concerned not about yourself, but the needs of other people. You're concerned about their benefits, their opportunities, potential threats to them, anything that can harm them or have a negative impact on them. So I think very easy to understand and flows naturally from perspective in being of service, the perspective of the sages to be of service. They would, of course, be overwhelmingly concerned about the welfare of the group, and the service that they provide, it implies all of the above. It is like when we talk about in modern times, we'll say things like, hey, you're looking out or watching out for others. You might say, I'm looking out for your own good. I'm watching out for your interest. Same idea. You treat their problems as your problems. You are protective of them just as you protect yourself. So this part, I think, is quite easy to understand. Let's continue. So looking at the entire line as a whole, the sages are outside of themselves and yet survive. Let me talk about the last part of it, to survive. In this context, it means to thrive. That is, to live a rigorous life. A life that is active, that is interesting, a life with a lot of stuff happening that is meaningful. This matches the previous line about being in front. So when you are in the back, you are serving and supporting everybody in the background. And being outside of yourself is matching that mentality, placing yourself in the back to be concerned about the others. The more you care about the others, the more you do well in life. Here, the insight from Lao Tzu is that this group dynamic works in a proportional way. In leadership, the person who is focused on serving and supporting others gets elevated to a prominent role. In personal interactions, the person who is focused on the well-being of other people ends up doing extremely well. So then, what happens if you care very little? Well, the reverse is also true. We have all seen examples of this. When you care very little, you also benefit very little. When you don't care at all, you derive zero benefits from this dynamic. Therefore, the tyrant who seeks power for its own sake, well, the tyrant ends up being overthrown. The person that we know who only has selfish concerns, well, that person ends up with a short end of the stick in life. So generally speaking, positive and negative energies in life follow a similar course. What you give out comes back to you multiplied several times. The world is sort of like a karmic energy amplifier and reflector. And there are people who talk about the rule of three. If you haven't heard of the rule of three, what it means is that whether it's good things or bad things, whatever you project out to the world, they get reflected back to you in triple strength. Karma comes back to you threefold. This may sound mystical, but it is actually based on observation of reality and common sense. To illustrate this, I want to share with everyone how it works visually in sort of a simplified example of personal interactions and the energy exchange with one another. So I want to start with this right here. This is a person who does not know or practice the Tao. The pattern, because this person doesn't know or practice the Tao, is going to be overall the negative side of the equation. These are patterns that we have seen in life. So imagine what happens when this person is lashing out in anger towards someone else. In blue, I've got the initial recipients of this negative energy. So when this happens, there's of course going to be an effect. There's going to be a negative consequence. This can easily happen to people who are not aware of the Tao, or perhaps study the Tao but doesn't apply it. Either way, we're talking about this person losing his temper, lashing out blindly. The negative energy that's received by this person in blue doesn't just dissipate. This person feeling negative will be venting frustration on someone else. So this can take different forms of negative manifestation. Either way, we've got an unhappy exchange of energy, and the bystander becoming unhappy and negative as well, will direct blame and criticism to the original initiator of that energy exchange. But then that's not the end of it. The initial recipients of negative energy may complain to yet another person. Already, we've got a doubling of energy from the initial projection of negativity. And it doesn't end there, because the initial recipient is now retaliating, striking back. This is the tripling that will oftentimes occur in life. Of course, the person who does not understand any of this may feel like the world is out to get him, not realizing he is the origin of his own misery. So what about the positive side? Let's look at another example. This time, somebody who understands and practices the Tao, the sage. This can also be a Tao cultivator like you and me. If you and I understand the Tao and we actively put it to use, we can end up in a positive situation. So we practice the Tao and we see someone who really needs help, and therefore we can provide assistance, guidance, and support. Now, this has a positive effect, so immediately the person who received the help is grateful. There's gratitude coming back to the person, you, who provided the assistance. But the positivity doesn't end there. The person who received the help decides to pay it forward. It is the Tao. There's a ripple effect. This causes positive energy to course through and affect another person, who in turn returns goodwill to the initial origin of the positive energy. And that doesn't end there, because the person who received the help may do an act of kindness to yet another person who will then return that positive energy to the Tao sage or the original initiator of that positive energy. So look at the difference. The person on the left who initiated the negativity will be like, why is everybody out to get me? Or may say, I knew it. They're all against me. Whereas the person on the right, the one who's projecting the positivity, is enjoying life because everything is good, everybody is so nice. It is also important to note that these patterns apply to everything. It's not just good deeds, bad deeds. I mean, every aspect of life. So for instance, finance can be an example. Money is a form of energy exchange. Therefore, those who give according to their ability to give will benefit from the giving threefold. And when I say giving according to the ability to give, it means providing a charitable, doing an act of charity, but keeping it well within your abilities so you don't damage your ability to continue giving. It is also important to note that most of the time, we cannot see these arrows. We cannot perceive the energy exchange that's taking place in the karmic plane. It is beyond our physical senses. And just because we don't see it, we should not assume that they do not exist. This is very real, and this is why people come up with the rule of three to describe how anything that put out there can come back to us magnified several times. And I have definitely seen instances where it's not just a tripling, but far more. Imagine something coming back to you multiplied 10 times. That can definitely happen. Indeed, it happens all the time to people who practice and follow the Tao. Let's continue on with the Tao Te Ching, chapter 7. Line 8. Line 8 says, is it not due to their selflessness? So I want to focus on the idea of being selfless, starting with singling out middle two characters that you see there to break them down. 无私. So the first character means no. It's a negation character, meaning not have any. And then the second character is being selfish or selfishness. So together, it just means a lack of selfishness or simply being selfless. This character, 私, it is the same meaning in ancient times as well as modern times. By itself, it means private, personal, something that is just for oneself. And the lack of selfishness is a commonality of heaven and earth, as well as the sage. This is what we seek to emulate. Now, I also want to inject a note here about the very last character that you see in line 8. This character is a sentence-ending character. It serves the same purpose as the punctuation mark that we know as period. Now, I want to explain this a little bit. The period, in this case, this sentence-ending character is the question mark. It's framing the whole line as a question. And sometimes you see an ending character that serves the same purpose as an exclamation. Now, as I mentioned previously, there were no punctuation marks in ancient Chinese. In modern Mandarin, there are definitely punctuation marks. To the Chinese culture, punctuation marks is a Western innovation that is very useful and therefore imported into the language. Now, in ancient times, people did not see the value or the necessity or even have a concept of punctuation marks. This is because many ancient Chinese characters were simplified drawings of physical things. For instance, the characters for water, tree, mountain, etc. The mentality of these characters was to depict something that is physical. Punctuation marks are not physical things. They're abstract. They're not simplified drawings. They signify tong, like, a question or an exclamation. They signify pauses, like the comma and the period. So they don't lend themselves to being simplified drawings. And that's why they did not exist in ancient Chinese. And that's the reason why there's the need for characters specifically assigned the duty of being the exclamation mark, the period, or in this case, the question mark. Next slide. So looking at line 8 as a whole, is it not due to their selflessness? So heaven and earth are selfless because they do not exist for themselves. This is something that we talked about last time. And when we say 无私, when we put 无, the negation character, in front of 私, the character for the self, the private, you get a meaning that is selfless, like altruistic. So the sages emulate this characteristic, and therefore, number one, they approach people in a selfless way by serving and supporting, much like heaven and earth supports all living things. Number two, the sages are concerned about the well-being of others rather than themselves. And this is what we talked about, being outside of themselves because they're concerned about others. So the sages are never driven by selfish needs. They do what they do to benefit other people, not themselves. Because they understand the Tao, they know such actions, benefiting others, will ultimately come back as positive energy to them. And that goes back to the karmic diagram, showing how positive energy going out, but then comes back multiplied. So let's talk about being selfless. In a very practical sense, in the material world, we know that being selfless has a number of benefits. It is an increase of happiness and satisfaction. When you help other people, I am positive you have experienced this. You feel good about having provided the assistance. It is something that can decrease stress and anxiety. You are focusing on the needs of others, and therefore taking your mind off your own worries and anxieties. It's a sense of calm and emotional well-being. So in a real sense, when you help others, you also help yourself. Reinforce sense of purpose. We're all here for a reason. We're in this world to do something, to fulfill a purpose. When you don't have a sense of what that purpose is, life can feel rather empty. To be selfless in assisting others, to engage in selfless acts, it will provide you with that sense of purpose. It's inherent in helping others. So all of this go into the category of emotional well-being. But then it goes beyond just your own emotional well-being. It helps you, it's a positive thing in helping you make a personal connection with the person that you are helping. In the process of helping that person, the connection that you make can be something as simple as just a smile for the moment. It can be something that develops into a long-term friendship. You just never know. Overall, personal connections like that just means that the community as a whole becomes stronger. And therefore, it's not just personal connection with one individual, it's a stronger connection within the overall community. And because of that, when we talk about other people, this can be a ripple effect. This is the pay it forward part, where what you do has effects well beyond the initial action. Now that's just the material world part. Everything on the left-hand side is what can happen, what we can see and perceive and feel, what we can see in the material world. But then I want to take it into the spiritual realm where things are not so easy to see. Sometimes they can be felt. So in spirituality, there is such a thing as karmic obligations. This is a common belief in Buddhism that many things we do in this lifetime are sourced in previous lifetimes. That is to say, if someone helped you, you are compelled to reciprocate. You are driven by the karmic debt to satisfy that obligation in reciprocation. So conversely, if you had done something wrong to another individual, you will have the opportunity to pay off your karmic debt. Now, we of course have no idea what we did previously. Even someone who subscribes to this belief system can recognize that we have no knowledge, no idea, whether good or bad, what actions we took before. But if you think about it, it is right and proper that we cannot remember what happened previously. Imagine what would be the case if we do remember. If I know that I should be good to someone to pay off a karmic debt, then I am doing it for that reason. Not because it is the right thing to do, not because I am a better person than I was in the previous lifetime, but because I am counting the points. I'm keeping the score on the karmic scale of justice. That has a way of short-circuiting the process, so the good that you do doesn't actually count. It doesn't count because it isn't authentic, it isn't genuine, it's not real. So it is right and proper that we do not remember because we want all of our actions to flow naturally. So I personally believe in this so much that I do the right thing anyway, no matter what. I don't know if I am paying back a karmic debt, if I'm satisfying some kind of karmic obligation. I just try to do the best I can for everyone, thinking that, well, there is a possibility that there's a karmic affinity or karmic connection here, and it is in my best interest to be good. So if there was an obligation, it will then be satisfied. If there wasn't an obligation, then what I would be doing is to create positive karma. And I will be creating that because it is the right thing to do, not because I'm expecting it to come back to me multiplied many times. Now, of course, when we talk about this, I know I have this intellectual understanding that the good that I put out will come back to me at some point. But I don't have specific expectations. So I tend to just put it out of my mind. And when it does come back, I probably will not know which of my previous actions was the source or the trigger or the cause. I'm not going to be able to trace the path of that flow of energy. I don't know how it went out, how it circled around, how it came back. I don't even bother thinking about it. Next, when it comes to the spiritual aspects of life, to be selfless is something that we practice as a virtue. This furthers the personal practice in compassion. It is also a practice in humility, because it is the realization that this selfless act is not about you. Serving the community requires you being humble and put thoughts of self-benefit, self-importance out of your mind. Therefore, to be selfless furthers the practice, the virtue of compassion and humility. Next, it connects you with the Tao. This is because when you are selfless, it brings you closer to the nurturing aspects of the Tao. The nearness to the Tao brings its own benefits, but we all want to be more similar to the Tao. Being selfless is one way to do it. Next, touch the oneness. To touch the oneness, what I mean by that is to be in touch with the oneness that unites all of us, that connects all of us. This is when I say, at a fundamental level of reality, we are connected as one. I believe this to be the absolute truth. And when I am being selfless, when I provide assistance, when I'm doing a good deed, I can feel the goodness that I do for others flowing back to me through the channels, the connections in that realm of oneness. And lastly, accumulate merits. So this idea is from Buddhism, where merit is a good that you do that was done without strings attached, that was unconditional, that you did not do the deed with expectations of a reward. Then it is real, it is authentic, it counts, and therefore it is called true merit. So in spirituality, being selfless has these positive connotations, positive effects and consequences. In both the material world and in spirituality, there are many reasons to be selfless. That is what I'm trying to say. Next line. That is how they can achieve their own goals. So I want to break this down. The 5 characters literally are the following. The first character is the character for thus. It can also be therefore or so. The pronoun they is assumed in this case, so the second character is can or able to. The third character is accomplish or to achieve, to complete. Then we have the possessive character again. The fourth character is there. In singular form, it will be his or her. And then the last character, that's the si that we were just talking about. It's the personal, the private, the selfish. So the transcription, if we string together the above, will be thus they can accomplish their personal goals. This is to say, the sages get what they want for themselves by helping others in a selfless way. So ironically, by being selfless, they can accomplish what others would perceive as selfish. This is a Tao pattern that applies from heaven and earth to all of humanity. It is a pattern that is universal. it doesn't have national, geographical, or cultural boundaries. As long as you are a human being, this pattern applies. So East or West, it is the same. Here, we're seeing it from the Tao Te Ching from ancient China, but in modern times in the West, I have a quote from Zig Ziglar. So Zig Ziglar was a motivational speaker. He was someone who mastered the arts of sales. He got to train a whole bunch of salespeople, and then later on, he provided coaching for senior executives. He was a life coach. He was, in addition to being a motivational speaker, he was also a book author. So one of the remarkable things that he said, Zig Ziglar said, you can have everything in life you want if you will just help enough other people get what they want. So this is another way to state the exact same thing that Lao Tzu wrote about, that the sages are being selfless in helping everybody, but then they end up achieving their own goals, which is what Zig Ziglar says as having everything in life that you want. Now, the same truth, the same pattern being universal is also something that is that goes across different spiritual traditions. And I want to share with you an example from Buddhism, so you can compare the example with the Tao to perceive the underlying oneness, the underlying connection, the sameness between the two. In the process, there's also a lot of information that I believe is simply not available in the West. If you are not connected with the original culture for the Eastern Asian culture for Buddhism, you simply have no way to get this information. So I want to show this slide with this figure that you see here. Let me direct your attention to the image on the right-hand side of this slide. It is another figure from Buddhism that is very prevalent in East Asia, and yet relatively unknown in the West. It is primarily revered in East Asian countries like Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, and so on. But over here, when people see it, when people see this image, they automatically assume it is the Buddha. They may say, oh, that's the Buddha. It is actually not. Now, people who have learned a bit about Buddhism will then say, oh, I know. It's not the Buddha, the original founder of Buddhism, because there are many Buddhas. So this is a Buddha, but not the Buddha. This is a Buddha, one of many Buddhas. That would also be incorrect. This is a Bodhisattva rather than a Buddha. A Bodhisattva in Chinese is 菩萨. Buddha in Chinese is 佛. What is the difference? So let me break down the term Bodhisattva for everyone. It is in two parts. Bodhi means wisdom, enlightenment. It's the great awakening. Sattva is a being, like a sentient being. When you put the two together, you are basically saying that this is a being of wisdom, a being who is enlightened. Specifically, a bodhisattva is someone who is only one step away from becoming the Buddha, to attain Buddhahood, to be fully awakened, to be fully enlightened. But because of that difference in the final step, the bodhisattva is not the same as the Buddha. I also want to note here that previously I have seen a misconception in the West where bodhisattva is assumed to mean goddess. It is primarily due to Guanyin Pusa, the Guanyin Bodhisattva, being referred to as the Buddha's goddess of mercy, or the Buddhist goddess of compassion. Guanyin Pusa is very popular. The Guanyin Bodhisattva, you see the image of Guanyin Pusa all over the place, and therefore the misconception. Now, it is correct to say that the Bodhisattva is connected to compassion, because the reason why the Bodhisattva decides to delay ascension into Buddhahood is to remain with all sentient beings in order to help. Therefore, the Bodhisattva is the personification of compassion. The purpose of the Bodhisattva is to assist all sentient beings in times of trouble, help them relieve their suffering, and guide them towards enlightenment. That is the only qualification, so a Bodhisattva can be male or female. The Bodhisattva is not the goddess. Let me further break down this particular Bodhisattva that you see here. This is the Kshiti Garbha Bodhisattva. And the name also breaks down into two parts. Kshiti is the ground or earth. Garbha means store, to contain, or something that is hidden, like a hidden treasure. So together, in Chinese, 地藏菩萨, very prevalent in Eastern practice of Buddhism. Customarily depicted with a staff in one hand, and you see it in this image, and a jewel in the other. That is one way to recognize the significance of this Bodhisattva and see that it is not the Buddha, is to look for the staff and the jewel. They have specific meaning associated to them. The staff is typically used by Buddhist monks of old, that when they walk around, when they travel, they will use a staff to strike the earth in front of them. The purpose is to startle and scare away insects and animals to prevent them from being accidentally harmed. So for instance, if you are walking around in the forest, you are hitting the ground with the staff in front of you, you are causing insects in front of you to scatter away, so you won't accidentally trample on them. It symbolizes great compassion, even for the smallest things, the smallest of the myriad things. The jewel held in the other hand is the jewel of manifestation of one's wishes. So the important thing to focus on right now is that this particular Bodhisattva is the ultimate example of selfless compassion. The staff and the jewel symbolize that they're connected, and this Bodhisattva is usually sitting on a lotus throne, signifying the liberation of this Bodhisattva from the cycles of life, birth, death, and rebirth. Typically, this particular Bodhisattva is seen in association with the afterlife. So specifically, you will see this Bodhisattva in cemeteries or mausoleums. Why is that? It is the association with the Buddhist concept of hell. Let me explain. When it comes to hell, it is very interesting. I want to talk about the difference in conception between East and West. In the Western concept of hell, if you look into traditional teachings, hell is taught to be the irreversible result of sin. That once you die and go to hell, you've lost your opportunity to choose the better path. You've lost the opportunity to choose heaven. And this leads to the urgency in the call to repent your sins. For that reason, hell is permanent, meaning there is no escape from hell. There's no possibility of escaping from hell. Now, I want to contrast that with the Eastern concept of hell. First, as I have noted in previous chapters, the original Tao had no emphasis at all on hell. It's heaven and earth. It doesn't get further divided. It doesn't get pointed out that below the earth, deeply underground, there's another world. There is this concept of hell. But there's definitely the concept of hell from Buddhism. And when Buddhist beliefs, including hell, became widespread in ancient China, the people definitely took to that, along with everything else. Hell was believed to be the place where people who have not done well in life, people who are evil, people who have done bad things, they go to hell in the afterlife. It's a place of darkness. It's a place of suffering, torture, damnation in the hereafter. So in that respect, it is very similar to the Western concept of hell. At a higher level of learning, among Buddhist students as well as those who cultivate the Tao, the understanding is that hell, rather than a place, is a state of mind. Compare that to the common concept of hell as a prison. But here is the difference between East and West. The common concept of hell is not an eternal prison. It is not forever. It is not a place from which there is no escape. In the Eastern paradigm, evil is real, but redemption is always a possibility. That is to say, no matter how lost a soul is, there is always a possibility to redeem yourself. No matter how far you are gone down the wrong path, you can always turn around and find your way back home. So, having seen all that, is the Buddhist concept of hell the place that bad people go after they die, or is it a state of mind? Which one is it? Well, the most truthful answer is that it is both. The best example is if you think about the people who, for instance, they harbor hatred. They're not willing to give up or let go when they die. With the dark thoughts in their minds, their soul, the soul of the deceased, enters a place of darkness. That is hell. As long as you're not able to let that go, the grasping onto those thoughts of hatred, for these spiritual entities, it is a place of torment, precisely because they are tormented by the hatred within them. It is therefore a place that they go in the afterlife, as well as a state of mind. So this is precisely what the Kshitigarbha Bodhisattva finds in hell. The Bodhisattva finds that hell is overflowing with lost souls who are under damnation. They are suffering, and he saw this for himself. There were so many, it threatened to overwhelm, engulf his senses, engulf his awareness. The massive extent of suffering was unbelievable. Now, hell, in the Buddhist conception, had no power to keep the Bodhisattva there. He could leave anytime he wished. He was not subjected to hell because he did not have the negativity that would put him there. He could simply depart and leave all the suffering of the souls to their fate. And another person would have done that because whatever it was that they needed to work through for themselves, whether it's anger, regret, violence, some kind of evil, it was their own responsibility to work through all that. But this bodhisattva's compassion was such that inaction would not be acceptable to him. He could not just do nothing. He had to help. And this was the reason behind his vow. He made a vow. And this is from the Kshitigarbha Sutra.
地狱不空，誓不成佛。众生度尽，方成菩提。
And I want to translate it for everyone. It comes in 4 parts of 4 characters each. Here is the translation. As long as hell is not empty, I vow to not attain Buddhahood. Only when all beings have been saved will I complete my enlightenment. Now, I want to point out that the first 4 characters map to the first line that you see in the translation. First 2 characters there, 地狱, that's hell. 不空, hell is not empty. Then the second line, the one to the right of it, I vow to not attain Buddhahood. This is because the bodhisattva is not yet a Buddha, as I explained. Then the third part, only when all beings have been saved. The term that he used for saving was to ferry, like to carry someone in a boat. The meaning is common in Buddhism. It is to metaphorically pull people up from the ocean of suffering into the boat of salvation. Now, the Kshitigarbha Bodhisattva knew that the only way to ferry people, in other words, to help them, the people in hell, was to teach them Dharmic lessons so they can let go of the darkness. They can liberate themselves, or like pull themselves from the ocean of suffering into the boat. So how could this be done? Well, the Bodhisattva will guide the souls in hell to look within. This is key number 1, is to turn inward, to recognize each individual should know that he or she is the solitary singular source of the suffering. That realization, that recognition will give them the power and ability to start making changes. Otherwise, they really are trapped in hell forever. And in order to make changes, they have to start by letting go of this need to point the finger at someone else. Like, I'm in hell because of those people or some external force. I'm in hell because of something. It isn't someone else or something else. It is you, yourself, who have put your own soul in this predicament. So that is realization number 1. That is the first key. The second key is tied to the concept of emptying hell. The overall goal of the Bodhisattva was to empty hell of the suffering souls. That's the macro external application of the expression. But if you were to apply the expression to empty hell internally, within each individual soul, hell literally is the extreme negativity, and it can be caused by poisons in the mind, like ignorance, malevolence, anxieties, and the list goes on and on. That is the hell within. the souls who can then be guided by Buddhist Dharma to cleanse themselves of that negativity will literally be emptying the hell within that is reflected in the hell externally. Then spiritual liberation will be within reach for them. So, in conclusion, this Bodhisattva's compassion and his vow reflect the Tao of this chapter exactly. His thoughts, intentions, and motivations are not for himself, but for all sentient beings still trapped in hell. So it is like heaven and earth. Heaven and earth become everlasting because they exist for everyone. This Bodhisattva exists for the souls suffering in hell, and therefore he becomes everlasting. This is why all over East Asia, the shrine of Kshitigarbha Bodhisattva occupies a central place of importance in cemeteries, mausoleums, memorial halls of temples everywhere. So when we learn from this Bodhisattva, I want you to consider the staff in one hand and the jewel in the other. The staff represents compassion, as I mentioned. The jewel manifests your wishes. It represents the coming to truth or reality of what you wish for. When you hold them, it means you possess genuine compassion for others, and your wishes manifest themselves into your reality. In other words, you care about people, and that is exactly how you end up with everything you want in life. Or, as Lao Tzu says at the very bottom of this slide, is it not due to your selflessness? That is how you can achieve your own goals. And this is why I say we have an exact correspondence between this Bodhisattva and the Tao teaching of this chapter. Now we are getting close to the top of the hour, so we need to jump to the summary for today. Previously, we talked about heaven and earth. We talked about how they exist indefinitely. They exist for the myriad of things, not for themselves, and we want to emulate that example. We want to dial down selfish concerns. We want to live for something that is greater. And when we do so, we're definitely going to notice the difference that this makes in life. Summary for today is about the sages, about how they can be putting themselves in the back, they can be outside of themselves in terms of their concerns. So putting themselves in the back is what we call servant leadership, providing assistance and support to everyone. And the natural consequence of that is people will place you front and center. So I want to invite everybody to see yourself as the servants of the group, not the master. And I will further say, you're going to have a great time doing this, following this teaching, because life is all about building good relationships. Everybody you help, everybody you get to know is like a fascinating book waiting for you to read. You're going to have a great time. Number 2, take care of others. Practice compassion, caring for the welfare of the group. The group will take excellent care of you. This goes back to our diagram of karmic energy exchange. The caring you put out comes back to you at least threefold. It is also related to number 1 because the value that you place on the group comes back to you as the value that the group will place on you. It therefore makes perfect sense that they want to bring you out from the back and place you in the front. Number 3, practice altruism. Here, I want to say work to benefit the group rather than yourself. You end up with the greatest benefits of all. That is to say, you plant the seeds of altruistic actions. In time, you will enjoy the blooming flowers, bountiful harvest, ample rewards in life. And this is the best way to go because it is the way that nature works. The results are all but guaranteed because it is the Tao. These 3 points that you see here are related and interconnected. I invite you to think of them as 3 refracting surfaces of the wish fulfillment gem held by the Bodhisattva. They may shine in different ways, but they originate from the same light. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.